Okay, so now that all 6 of my pieces are blocked and ironed, I am ready to move on to our assignment. So we are going to be sewing a series of 3 samplers. The first is a 1/2 inch by 1/4 inch grid. So this is really working on precision sewing. We're going to trace all of these lines and work to sew directly on top of them using the machine. You should see a progression from beginning to end of being able to stay on top of the machine, having some really clean back stitching at the beginning and end of each line, side to side both ways. So again, that's a 1/4 inch by 1/2 inch grid that we'll get started with first. The second square that we'll be working on is a 1/2 inch pivot maze. So we'll be starting from the outside and drawing some 1/2 inch lines that move inward all the way towards the center. We are not backstitching in the corners, so we'll work on getting really nice clean points on all of those corners as we move through this piece. So that's the second one. And the third one, and by far the trickiest, is our 1/2 inch curve line series. So what we are going to do is make a little template of a curved line and then move it incrementally up a 1/2 inch and fill the entire piece with sewing those curved lines. This will by far take the most time, even though there's a substantial amount of sewing on the grid sampler. The 1/2 inch curved lines take a lot of pivoting in order to maintain smooth sewing. Where there you see moments like this is really some uneven pivoting, right? Or really trying to twist the fabric rather than adjust the needle. So we'll take some time to practice that, but again, you should see it incrementally get better and better. So we'll start off with our first sampler, the 1/2 inch by 1/4 inch grid. All of our samplers are going to be 2 plies, so we made 6 total squares, blocked and ironed, but I'm only going to trace the lines on 1 layer. So I'm going to start off from the edge, and I'm going to start with my 1/4 inch lines. So I'm just going to try to make sure that my frayed edge here aligns with the 1/4 inch as closely as I can get it, and I'll use my mechanical pencil to go ahead and create a straight line with the edge of my clear graph ruler. The clear graph rulers are instrumental in making sure that we stay on top of that line each and every time. They also help with the snagging of the material if you've ever experienced that as you're tracing onto fabric that it wants to move. This really anchors it down and does not allow that to happen. So I'm going to just keep repeating these lines all the way until I fill up the piece. I'm very two-handed when I do anything in my sewing practice, so I'm definitely putting some weight down on the ruler to make sure that it doesn't budge. And kind of going back and over those lines. If you notice one is just a little bit lighter, you can go back in. Okay, so as I move along, I'm keeping my straight lines really consistently spaced on that 1/2 inch line. I'm going to continue moving as I fill up the piece. And I should have made a note that my lines are running parallel to the lengthwise grain. It doesn't really matter which set of lines does, they both, one of them will end up running parallel. Next, after I finish filling it up, I'm going to go ahead and switch my material. So just flip it, and I'm going to go ahead and start moving and tracing my 1/2 inch lines. So again, this is a 1/2 inch by 1/4 inch grid. So just like so, moving through the piece. Okay, and you'll continue to move on to fill up the entire piece. So we really want to see this entire sampler covered. Okay, so I'll set this aside. The next up is that 1/2" pivot maze. So for the 1/2" pivot maze, I am starting my maze from the exterior. So I'm going to take my piece of fabric and line up my 1/2" line about with the frayed edge. I'm going to go ahead and draw. You can take it all the way to the end. From that edge, again, I'm going to square it at the top here and carry this line down. Okay. And I'm going to keep pivoting my fabric and tracing until we get all the way to the center. When I come to complete the square, I'm going to stop a 1/2 inch away from my initial first line. Just right there. If you are a light tracer, you can go in and darken the line. So when we're sewing, it's really important to make sure that we can sew not only a straight line, but also very clean corners. It makes all the difference in a garment. Okay, we are finally approaching the end. Be prepared to give yourself plenty of time, even though we are just drawing straight lines. Everything is a process, especially when it comes to sewing. We always say, like, if your project, you think it'll take an hour, cutting and tracing will take like 50 minutes and you'll be sewing for only 10. It really does take a long time to make something. Okay. I'll get as close to the center as I possibly can. Okay, and that's that. Okay, so that is our 1/2" pivot mace. Now for our last piece, I have, excuse me, just a scrap of fabric. And so for our curved line sampler, I'm going to trace a template or create a template of a curved line. The more subtle the curve, the easier it will be to sew. The more dynamic the curve, the more difficult and more pivoting you'll have to do. So be mindful of that. If you're a beginner, I would do something a little bit, a little more subtle, a little bit less deep in terms of the curve. I'm going to go ahead and just arbitrarily kind of sketch a curve. It doesn't have to be perfect, it's just a curved line to work with. And then I'm going to go ahead and cut it out. I didn't worry about the size of this. I'll kind of align it when I put it on my fabric and see what it does. And this is just from some cardstock I had laying around. You can see I have an old traced pattern on it. Any piece of paper, especially if it's a little bit heavier, will be perfect. Okay, so I'll line it with my green line. Perfect. And I'll just kind of start at the edge and begin tracing this curved line shape. I still have my clear graph ruler handy. What I'm going to do is mark from the apex of both curves a 1/2 inch so that I can just shift up. Right, so just right there. Move this to the side. And if they're not perfect, that's totally fine. We're just shifting this pattern piece up. If you hear any background noise, I do have a cat and a dog, so they might make an appearance from time to time. so I've made it about halfway through this piece. I'll take away my pattern piece, and this works great. So you can see they're pretty evenly spaced. If anything gets a little off, that's totally fine. It's really just about practicing lines on top of our tracings just to make sure that we are staying on point. So I'll continue going and fill up this, and then we are all ready to get started sewing.